everyone, and welcome back to the Wisdom by Harry YouTube channel. My name is Harry.
And I'm Mary. We're so excited to have you here today for another fascinating deep dive. Today, we're diving into something that I think a lot of you can relate to, learning English.
Yeah.
But with a twist, we're going to be looking at how podcast conversations can actually be a secret weapon for improving your fluency and confidence.
That's right.
We've been exploring a YouTube channel that's using this approach to teaching English. And let me tell you, there are some really insightful takeaways here for anyone who wants to sound more natural and comfortable when they speak.
Yeah.
So what makes these podcast conversations so effective? I mean, we're all used to textbooks and language apps, but there's something different about hearing real people talking, isn't there? Well, what's fascinating here is that textbooks, while useful for building a foundation, often present language in a very structured and, let's face it, some artificial way, podcast conversations, on the other hand, throw you right into the deep end of authentic language. You're hearing idioms, slang, different accents, all the messy, beautiful things that make up real-world communication.
Exactly. It's like the difference between reading about swimming and actually jumping into a pool. You might know the theory, but until you experience the water, the currents, or the unexpected splashes, you're not really getting the full picture.
Right.
And that's where this YouTube channel comes in. They take these real podcast conversations and break them down into digestible chunks, explaining the vocabulary, the grammar nuances, even the cultural context behind what's being said. I love that they don't shy away from the complex stuff. For example, one episode we looked at focuses on business English, and they use a hilarious scenario with a demanding boss to teach phrases like drive sales or it'll never fly.
You know, that makes me think about how important humor can be in language learning. I mean, if you can laugh while you're learning, aren't you more likely to remember what you've learned?
That's a really interesting point. Traditional language learning can sometimes feel so serious, so textbook-driven. But if you can inject some humor, some real-world situations that people can connect with, it becomes so much more engaging.
Yeah.
And that's something this YouTube channel seems to understand really well. They're not just teaching vocabulary, they're creating an environment where learners can feel comfortable making mistakes, experimenting with the language, and ultimately sounding more natural.
It's almost like they're encouraging you to find your own voice within the language rather than just mimicking what you hear in a textbook.
Yeah.
They have this concept called fluency builders, which I found really intriguing.
Oh, tell me about those. What exactly are fluency builders?
Well, they're essentially techniques that help you sound more like a native speaker. For example, instead of saying, "I will arrive soon," they suggest using a phrase like, "I'll be here any minute." It's a subtle shift, but it makes a big difference in how natural you sound.
It's the subtle shifts that can really trip you up when you're learning a language, though.
Okay.
I remember when I was first learning English, I used to get so caught up in trying to translate everything literally from my native language. It took me a while to realize that sometimes you need to let go of the direct translation and just go with what sounds natural in English.
Right.
And that's where having a guide like this YouTube channel can be so valuable. They're pointing out those nuances, those little tricks of the language that you might not pick up on your own. They're almost like a language coach, helping you to refine your skills and sound more confident.
It makes me wonder if there's a parallel here to learning any new skill, really, whether it's playing an instrument or mastering a sport. Having someone who can point out those subtle but important adjustments can make all the difference in your progress.
Absolutely. It's like having a mentor who can see your potential even when you're struggling to see it yourself.
Yeah.
And in the case of language learning, that can be the key to unlocking a whole new level of fluency and confidence.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on this idea of using podcast conversations as a learning tool? Do you think it's something that could benefit anyone who wants to improve their English?
I think it has the potential to be incredibly effective, especially for people who are maybe a little bit stuck in their learning journey, The ones who have a good grasp of the grammar but struggle with sounding natural or feeling confident when they speak.
Yeah, I agree. It's like taking all of that knowledge you've accumulated and putting it into practice in a safe and engaging environment. This YouTube channel is doing something really unique, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
By highlighting these real conversations, they're not just teaching English, they're teaching you how to participate in real-world communication.
Exactly. And that's something that textbooks and language apps can only do so much to prepare you for.
This whole approach makes me think about the bigger picture of language learning. It's not just about memorizing vocabulary or mastering grammar rules, is it?
It's about connecting with people, sharing ideas, and expressing yourself authentically. And I think that's something that this YouTube channel really captures.
I'm really curious to hear more about how they approach this idea of fluency building.
Well, one thing that stood out to me was their emphasis on the subtle differences between how native and non-native speakers use certain phrases.
Oh, that's so interesting. Can you give me an example?
Absolutely. They pointed out that non-native speakers often use the phrase think about in situations where a native speaker would naturally say consider. It's a small change, but it instantly elevates your language and makes you sound more sophisticated.
It's fascinating how those tiny tweaks can make such a big difference. Do they explain why these subtle shifts are important?
Yes. They argue that using these fluency builders not only makes you sound more natural, but also helps to boost your confidence. When you feel like you're speaking more like a native speaker, you're less likely to hesitate or second-guess yourself, which ultimately leads to more fluent and engaging conversations.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like when you're wearing a perfectly tailored suit, you just feel more confident and self-assured. But do you think there's a risk of these fluency builders sounding forced or unnatural if they're not used correctly?
That's a great question, and it's something they actually address on the channel. They emphasize that the key is to integrate these phrases gradually and naturally into your speech. It's not about memorizing a list of fancy phrases, but rather about developing an ear for how native speakers use language and then trying to incorporate those nuances into your own speaking style.
So it's more about observation and imitation rather than rote memorization.
Exactly, and they make a great point about how this process of observation and imitation can actually be quite enjoyable. They encourage learners to actively listen to podcasts, movies, and TV shows, paying attention to how native speakers use language in different contexts.
That reminds me of something I've been thinking about lately, the role of enjoyment in language learning. It seems like so many language learning resources focus on drills and exercises, which can be effective, but they can also be incredibly boring. Do you think there's a connection between enjoyment and effectiveness?
I think that's a brilliant observation. When you're genuinely enjoying the learning process, you're more likely to be engaged, to remember what you've learned, and to keep coming back for more. And this YouTube channel really seems to tap into that by using humor-relatable scenarios and real-world conversations to make learning English feel less like a chore and more like a fun and rewarding experience.
It's almost like they're turning language learning into a form of entertainment.
Exactly. And they're not just passively entertaining you, they're actively engaging your brain and challenging you to think critically about the language you're learning.
I'm starting to see how this YouTube channel goes beyond just teaching English. It's almost like a masterclass in communication itself.
That's a really insightful way to put it. By breaking down these podcast conversations, they're not just teaching you vocabulary and grammar, they're teaching you how to analyze conversations, how to understand different communication styles, and how to effectively convey your own ideas.
So it's not just about becoming fluent in English, it's about becoming a more effective communicator overall.
Precisely. And that's a skill that's valuable in any language, in any context.
I'm really impressed with the depth of thought that's gone into this channel. It's clear that they're not just throwing together random content. They're carefully curating materials and crafting lessons that are both informative and engaging.
It's like they've taken the best elements of traditional language learning, the structured lessons, the glamour explanations, and combined them with the dynamism and authenticity of real-world conversations.
I'm curious, do they ever address the challenges of learning English through conversation? It seems like it could be overwhelming for beginners, especially if they're not used to the speed and spontaneity of native speech.
That's a valid concern, and it's something they definitely acknowledge. They encourage beginners to start with shorter, simpler conversations and to gradually work their way up to more challenging material. They also emphasize the importance of not being afraid to make mistakes.
That's so important. So many language learners get paralyzed by the fear of making mistakes, but it's through those mistakes that we actually learn and grow.
Absolutely. This channel seems to create a safe and supportive space for learners to experiment with the language without feeling judged or self-conscious.
Do they offer any specific tips for overcoming those initial hurdles?
Yes. They have a whole section dedicated to strategies for active listening, which they say is crucial for anyone who wants to improve their conversational skills. They encourage learners to focus on the overall meaning of a conversation rather than getting bogged down in every single word.
That's so true. I remember when I was learning your native language, I used to get so frustrated when I couldn't understand every single word. It took me a while to realize that I could still follow the gist of the conversation even if I missed a few details.
And that's such a liberating realization. Once you let go of that need to understand everything perfectly, you can actually start to relax and enjoy the process of listening and learning.
I'm really struck by how this channel seems to address both the practical and the psychological aspects of language learning. They're not just giving you tools, they're helping you to develop the mindset and the confidence you need to succeed.
They seem to understand that language learning is a journey, not a destination. There are going to be ups and downs, moments of frustration, and moments of triumph. But the key is to keep going, to keep practicing, and to never lose sight of your goals.
And to find resources like this YouTube channel that can inspire and support you along the way.
Speaking of support, I was also impressed by how they emphasize the importance of community in language learning. They encourage learners to find language partners, join online forums, and basically surround themselves with people who are also passionate about learning English.
Creating that sense of community can be so powerful. It's like having a whole team of cheerleaders cheering you on as you're tackling the challenges of language learning.
And it's not just about emotional support, it's also about having people to practice with, to bounce ideas off of, and to learn from. It's like having a built-in network of language mentors who can help you along the way.
You know, it's making me think about how this approach could be applied to learning any new skill, really. It's about finding the right resources, cultivating a growth mindset, and surrounding yourself with a supportive community.
That's such a powerful insight. It's about creating an environment where you feel empowered to learn, to grow, and to ultimately achieve your goals.
This whole deep dive has really opened my eyes to the potential of podcast conversations as a learning tool. I'm curious, what are your final thoughts on this?
What's fascinating to me is how this YouTube channel has managed to take something as commonplace as a podcast conversation and transform it into a powerful engine for language acquisition. They've really tapped into the power of authentic communication and shown how it can be harnessed to accelerate language learning.
It's like they've cracked the code to making language learning feel less like a chore and more like a natural extension of how we learn and connect with the world around us.
Yeah.
And for anyone out there who's feeling stuck in their English learning journey, or maybe just looking for a more engaging and enjoyable way to learn, I think this approach offers a really exciting path forward.
I completely agree. This deep dive has really challenged my own assumptions about language learning and shown me that there's always more to explore and discover.
And speaking of exploring and discovering, we want to hear from you. What are some of the creative ways you've incorporated podcasts into your English learning routine? Have you tried transcribing a particularly interesting segment, or maybe even role-playing a conversation with a friend?
Oh, that's a good one.
Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your ideas. And remember, whether you're using podcasts, YouTube channels, or any other resources, the key to success in language learning is to find what works for you, to embrace the journey, and to never stop exploring the fascinating world of language. Until next time, keep those conversations flowing and keep diving deep into the things that spark your curiosity.